the woman who mopped the floor of Harrington Hall every morning at 4:47 a.m., had been doing it for so long that the marble had learned the pattern of her mop. She had a system. Left corner to right corner, long slow strokes, the mop head overlapping by exactly half a width on each pass. Then the baseboards with the smaller mop. Then the bathroom off the second floor corridor. The one the graduate students used, the one that always smelled of instant noodles and anxiety, and the particular desperation of people who had been awake since midnight, trying to understand something that did not want to be understood. Then the faculty lounge on the third floor. Then the corridor outside the dean's office. Then the stairwell. By 6:30 a.m. she was done with Harrington Hall. By 7 a.m. she had started on Whitmore. By 9:15 a.m., she was back in the custodial closet on the ground floor of Harrington, changing out of her gray uniform into the clothes she had packed in the bottom of her cleaning cart. Dark slacks, a pressed blouse, flat shoes. A small bag she kept separate from everything else. Her notebooks, her pencils, her annotated copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved, which she had read 4 times, and each time found something she had missed the previous 3. By 9:30 a.m., she was sitting in the second row of Professor Adeyemi's survey of African American literature class. Her notebook open, her pen moving, her face carrying the specific expression of a woman who has been waiting her entire life to be in this room. Nobody in the class knew her name was Celestine. To the university, she was employee number 4471. To the students whose hallways she cleaned, she was the woman with the mop cart. To the faculty whose lounges she restocked with coffee pods and clean mugs, she was a gray uniform and a soft footstep that was careful not to interrupt anything important. But in Professor Adeyemi's classroom, she was a student. She had been a student for 19 years, and in 11 weeks, if everything went according to plan, she would be a graduate. Her name was Celestine Amara Oduya. She was 57 years old. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, and had come to the United States in 1989 with her husband, a quiet civil engineer named Emeka, and a daughter named Adaora, who was 3 years old, and who 20 years later would become the first person in their family to hold a university degree, a degree that Celestine had worked 2 jobs and most of her sleeping hours to make possible. But that was Adaora's story. This is Celestine's. Celestine had started working as a custodial staff member at Whitmore University in Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 2004. The university sat on 43 acres in northwest D.C. It had been founded in 1867. One of the great historically black universities of America, a place where people who had been told for centuries that they did not belong in the rooms where knowledge was kept had built their own rooms and walked into them anyway. It had graduated senators, surgeons, judges, poets, engineers, musicians. It had a library with 4 floors and a reading room with tall windows and wooden study carrels, worn smooth by 150 years of hands. It had a quad where in the spring the cherry trees bloomed and students lay in the grass with their laptops and their highlighters, and the specific contentment of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. Celestine pushed her mop cart through all of it. She had started at Whitmore because it was the job that paid the most for her qualifications, which in 2004 were limited. Her Lagos secondary school certificate, her incomplete university application from a Nigerian university she had left when Emeka got sick and they needed money, and the English that she spoke with an accent that some people found beautiful and some people found an opportunity to patronize. The custodial supervisor at Whitmore, a thick-armed woman named Mrs. Holloway, who had been managing the university's cleaning staff for 22 years, had looked at Celestine's application forms and said, "You start Monday, 5 a.m. Celestine had not been late, not once, in 19 years. She had worked the early shift because the early shift paid a small differential, and because the early shift meant she was done with her buildings by 9 lines or 9:30 a.m. and could make the 9:30 lectures. She had enrolled in her first class at Whitmore. Introduction to Literature, a freshman course, a course designed for 18-year-olds who had just arrived on campus from suburban high schools in the autumn of 2005. She had been 40 years old. She had paid for the course herself, with the money from the second job she worked on Saturdays cleaning offices in Georgetown. She had sat in the back of that first class on a September morning in 2005, and she had not looked left or right. She had looked at the professor. She had opened her notebook. She had written the date at the top of the page in her small, careful handwriting, and she had begun. She had taken one course per semester for 19 years, sometimes two, if the semester aligned with her schedule. She had taken English literature and African American history and sociology and political science and women's studies, an introduction to philosophy and survey of African literature and research methods, and writing for publication and poetry, and all the courses that the 19-year-old students took, and some that they didn't, because Celestine was not choosing her courses for efficiency. She was choosing them for hunger. She had a 3.8 GPA. She had written a paper on the political theology of James Baldwin that her professor had submitted to an academic journal without telling her first. She had found out when the journal sent the acceptance letter to the university's student email address they had assigned her. She had read the acceptance email sitting in the custodial closet in Harrington Hall with her gray uniform still on and her mop propped in the corner. She had not told anyone. Not her daughter Adeyemi, who had her own degree and her own life now, working as a pediatric doctor at Howard University Hospital. Not her sister in Lagos, who still called her every Sunday and still asked, with the specific patience of a sister who has been waiting a long time, Celestine, when are you coming home? Not the colleagues she ate lunch with in the custodial break room, Darnell, who had driven a school bus for 20 years before this, and who told the same story about a blizzard in 1996 every single Thursday, and Rochelle, who was saving up to open a hair salon in Anacostia, and who knew the name and ambitions of every student on the quad. Not Mrs. Holloway, who had hired her, and who, over the years, had come to rely on Celestine the way institutions come to rely on the people they most consistently underestimate, completely and without acknowledgement. And not Professor Marcus Webb, the chairman of the English department, who taught the advanced seminar on American modernism that Celestine had taken in the spring of 2021, and who had pulled her aside after the final class to say, Mrs. Oduya, your paper on Zora Neale Hurston was the best work submitted in this class. I would like to write you a recommendation letter for graduate school. Celestine had looked at him. She had been 60 years old then. Wait, 56. She had said, Thank you, Professor Webb. That is very kind. She had not told him that she had not yet finished her undergraduate degree. She had not told him that she had been a custodial worker in his building for 16 years. She had not told him that the day he turned in his grades for the modernism seminar, she had mopped the corridor outside his office twice, because the first time she had been thinking so hard about Hurston that she had done only the left corner to right corner pass and forgotten the baseboards. She had not told him anything. She had gone back to the custodial closet, changed into her uniform, and gone back to work. That had been 4 years ago. Now it was the spring of 2024. Celestine was 57 years old and 11 weeks from graduating. Her final 3 courses were Survey of African American Literature with Professor Adeyemi, Advanced Research Writing with Dr. Kim, and an independent study on West African oral traditions and their influence on the Harlem Renaissance, that she was completing under Professor Webb, who still did not know who she was. The independent study required a 40-page thesis. She had written 37 pages. She needed 3 more. She also needed to survive the next 11 weeks without her secret becoming a problem. She had done a very careful calculation many years ago, around 2009 or 2010, when she realized that her double life at Whitmore had gone on long enough to become structural, about what would happen if the university found out that one of its custodial employees had been attending classes as a student. She had consulted the student handbook and the employee handbook. She had found, to her relief, that there was no explicit prohibition on a staff member also being a student. There was, however, a clause in the employee agreement about conflicts of interest that was vaguely worded enough to be used against almost anything by an administrator who wanted to use it that way. She had decided not to worry about it. She had decided to simply get to graduation, and then the question would be moot. She had not accounted for Mr. Gerald Pitts. Gerald Pitts was 43 years old. He had been appointed Associate Vice President for Operational Efficiency at Whitmore University 18 months earlier, arriving from a consulting firm in Baltimore where he had spent a decade telling institutions how to cut costs without appearing to cut anything. He was, in the taxonomy of university administrators, a specific and recognizable type. The man who arrives with a mandate to find inefficiencies and who has learned, over a long career, that the most efficient way to find inefficiencies is to look at the people who cannot easily defend themselves. He wore good suits. He used words like streamlining and right-sizings and resource reallocation. He had conducted, in his 18 months at Whitmore, a review of every non-academic department on campus. He had cut 3 positions in the library. He had cut 2 positions in student services. He had reorganized the food services contract. He had looked at the custodial department and seen a department that was, in his assessment, overstaffed by 15%. He had generated a list. Celestine's name was on it. She found out on a Wednesday morning in February. A Wednesday morning that started like any other Wednesday morning. 4:47 a.m. in Harrington Hall. Left corner to right corner, long slow strokes. The mop head overlapping by exactly half a width. But when she arrived at the custodial break room at 8:15 to change into her student clothes before her 9:30 class, Mrs. Holloway was waiting for her. Mrs. Holloway, who had hired her 19 years ago, Mrs. Holloway, who had said, "Don't be late," and who had never once needed to say it again, Mrs. Holloway, whose face, when Celestine walked in that morning, was the face of a woman who is about to deliver news she has been dreading since she read an email the evening before and has not slept since. She handed Celestine a letter. The letter was on Whitmore University letterhead. It was signed by Gerald Pitts, Associate Vice President for Operational Efficiency. It says that due to a review of custodial staffing levels, Celestine's position was being eliminated effective April 1st. It said she would receive 6 weeks of severance pay. It said she could apply for any open positions at the university. It said the university thanked her for her 19 years of service. It said nothing about her 37-page thesis on West African oral traditions and their influence on the Harlem Renaissance. It said nothing about the Introduction to Literature class in 2005. It said nothing about the paper on James Baldwin that had been published in an academic journal. It said nothing about Survey of African American Literature, which she was passing with a grade of 94. It said nothing about 11 weeks. Celestine read the letter twice. Mrs. Holloway stood across from her, watching her face. Mrs. Holloway's own face was doing several things at once: grief, guilt, the specific helplessness of a supervisor who has been given an order by someone above her and who does not agree with it, but who does not have the institutional standing to refuse it. "Celestine," Mrs. Holloway said. "I see," said Celestine. "I fought it. I want you to know that. I sent an email to Pitts's office. I called HR. "I know you did," Celestine said, although she had not known. But she knew Mrs. Holloway, and she knew what kind of woman Mrs. Holloway was. "If you want to appeal, I will think about it," said Celestine. She folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her gray uniform. She picked up her cleaning cart. She went to the 3rd floor and finished the faculty lounge. She went to the corridor outside the dean's office. She went to the stairwell. She did not go to her 9:30 class that day. She sat in the custodial closet in Harrington Hall, with the letter in her lap and her annotated copy of Beloved on the floor beside her cleaning cart. And she thought about 19 years and 11 weeks, and what the distance between them meant. She had been 11 weeks away from graduating before. She had been 11 weeks away from graduating in the spring of 2012, when Emeka died. Suddenly, a heart attack at his desk, at the engineering firm where he had worked for 14 years. And she had taken a medical leave of absence from her courses and had not returned for 2 full years. She had been 11 weeks away from graduating in 2019 when Adeora's son, Celestine's first grandchild, a boy named Kofi, who had arrived 6 weeks early and spent his first month in the neonatal intensive care unit at Howard University Hospital, had needed his grandmother to be at the hospital because Adeora's husband was traveling for work, and Adeora needed someone. Celestine had taken an incomplete in 2 of her 3 courses, and had finished them the following semester, from the NICU waiting room, writing her paper on Langston Hughes on a yellow legal pad between visits. She had been 11 weeks away before, but she had never been 11 weeks away and fired at the same time. She sat in the custodial closet for 40 minutes. Then she dried her eyes with the sleeve of her gray uniform. Then she picked up her cleaning cart. Then she went back to work. She went back to work because Celestine Amara Oduya had been going back to work for 57 years, and she did not know how to do anything else. She went back to work because in 11 weeks there would be a ceremony in the Whitmore University auditorium. The same auditorium she had cleaned every May for 19 years, the one with the high ceiling and the oil portraits of the founders on the walls and the stage with the podium where the dean would stand and read names. And she intended to be there when her name was read. She went back to work because her husband was buried in a cemetery in Northeast D.C. with a headstone that said Emeka Odaya, beloved husband and father, and she had made him a promise at that graveside 12 years ago that she was not going to break because of a man named Gerald Pitts, who used words like right-sizing, and had never once, in 18 months of walking the corridors of Harrington Hall, made eye contact with the woman who mopped them. She went back to work. And then, carefully, methodically, with the same system she applied to mopping floors, left corner to right corner, long slow strokes, each pass overlapping the last. She began to figure out how to survive the next 11 weeks. If she lost her job on April 1st, she would lose her employee health insurance. She could manage that. Adora would add her to her plan. She would lose her income. 6 weeks of severance plus her savings would get her to graduation. She would lose access to the custodial break room, where she stored her student clothes, but she could change in the women's restroom on the second floor of the library. She would lose the employee parking permit, but she took the bus. She would not lose her enrollment. Her enrollment was as a student, not as an employee. Gerald Pitts's letter had said nothing about her enrollment, because Gerald Pitts did not know about her enrollment. Her university identification card had a different number from her employee badge. She had registered for classes under her student ID. Her financial aid, she received a small need-based grant and paid the rest herself, was processed through the financial aid office, not HR. The two systems had never been connected. In 19 years, nobody had connected them. She was employee number 4471 in the HR system and student number 782034 in the registrar's system, and the two numbers had never been in the same room. She intended to keep it that way for 11 more weeks. She told no one. Not Adora, who called every Sunday and who would have immediately driven from Howard University Hospital to Whitmore University to stand in Gerald Pitts's office and do the kind of thing that people who have been to medical school do when their mothers are threatened, loudly, effectively, and with references to lawyers. Not Rochelle or Darnell in the break room, not Mrs. Holloway, not Professor Adeyemi, whose survey of African American literature class she went back to attending the Thursday after receiving her termination letter, sitting in the second row with her notebook open and her pen moving, her face carrying the same expression it always carried in that room. The expression of a woman who has been waiting her entire life to be there. She served out her notice, she mopped her floors, she cleaned her bathrooms. She finished her thesis, all 40 pages of it. She turned it in to Professor Webb on a Thursday morning in March. She slid it under his office door at 7:15 a.m. because she had just finished mopping the corridor outside his office, and she had her cleaning cart with her, and she did not want to be seen by anyone she knew in her student life while she was in her work uniform. She heard his coffee maker running inside the office. She heard the specific sound of a man who was already at work at 7:15 a.m. on a Thursday morning. She stood outside his door for a moment with her hand on the handle of her mop cart and the 40-page thesis in its manila envelope in her other hand. She slid the envelope under the door. She pushed her mop cart down the corridor. Her last day as a custodial employee at Whitmore University was April 1st. Mrs. Holloway gave her a card signed by the department. Rochelle cried openly in the break room and said, "Celestine, I'm going to name one of the chairs in my salon after you. The best chair. The one by the window." Darnell told the story about Blizzard in 1996 for possiblest time, or possibly not, because Darnell had been telling that story for 15 years and showed no signs of stopping. Mrs. Holloway hugged her, a real hug, long and tight, the hug of a woman saying goodbye to someone she should have said more to over 19 years. Celestine accepted the card. She thanked Rochelle. She listened to Darnell's Blizzard story one final time. She hugged Mrs. Holloway back. Then she took off her gray uniform for the last time. She folded it carefully. She placed it on the hook inside the custodial closet. She picked up her bag, her student bag, the one with the notebooks and the pencils and the now worn and heavily annotated copy of Beloved. And she walked out of the custodial break room in her dark slacks, and her pressed blouse and her flat shoes. And she walked across the Whitmore University quad in the early April morning. And she went to her 9:30 class. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked at her differently. She sat in the second row of Professor Adeyemi's survey of African American literature. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She had 7 weeks left. The weeks went the way weeks go when you are holding your breath. Slowly and then suddenly, She went to her classes. She wrote her papers. She took her exams. She sat in the second row of Survey of African American Literature and in the front row of Advanced Research Writing, and she met twice a week with Professor Webb in his office to discuss her independent study thesis, which he had read and returned to her with 17 pages of handwritten notes. 17 pages for a 40-page thesis, and which he had said, in the second meeting, in the particular quietly astonished voice of a professor who has been reading student work for 30 years, and has learned not to be surprised by excellence, but who is surprised anyway. Mrs. Oduya, where did this come from? She had smiled. She had said, I have been thinking about it for a long time, Professor Webb. He had looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who suspects he is not being told the whole story. Then he had nodded. Then they had gone back to the thesis. He had not connected the name Oduya on her student record to the name Oduya that appeared on the custodial department roster he had walked past in Mrs. Holloway's window every year without reading. He had not known. And then it was May. And then it was the week of graduation. And then it was the morning of graduation. And Celestine Amara Oduya was 57 years old and dressed in a black graduation gown with the blue and gold regalia of Whitmore University across her shoulders. And she was standing in the staging area behind the auditorium with 314 other graduating students, most of whom were 22 or 23 years old, and who had spent the last 4 years at Whitmore, and who were going to law school or medical school or graduate school or their first jobs in the fall, and who looked at Celestine the way young people sometimes look at older people at ceremonies, with a politeness that is also a question. She did not explain herself to anyone. She stood in the staging area in her black graduation gown, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about Emeka. She thought about him sitting in the plastic chair in the oncology waiting room at Howard University Hospital. No, that was her imagination. Emeka had not had cancer. Emeka had had a heart attack at his desk, fast, without warning. And she had not been there, and she had gotten the call from his colleague. And she had been cleaning the stairwell of Harrington Hall when her phone buzzed. She thought about him sitting at their kitchen table in the row house in Petworth, reading the newspaper on Sunday mornings. She thought about him saying, on the afternoon of the day they arrived in Washington, D.C. in 1989, standing outside Union Station with 2 suitcases and a 3-year-old daughter, and the particular weightlessness of people who have left everything they know. Celestine, whatever happens here. They had been okay. More than okay. She thought about Adeyemi, who was sitting somewhere in the auditorium right now, having driven from Howard University Hospital in her work clothes. Celestine had told her about the graduation at Christmas 4 hours earlier on the phone, and Adeyemi had not spoken for 17 seconds and then had said, in a voice that Celestine recognized as the voice Adeyemi used when she was trying not to cry, Mama, how long have you been doing this? And Celestine had said, 19 years. And Adeyemi had said nothing for another moment and then had said, I'm coming to the graduation, Mama. Don't tell me I can't come. Celestine had not told her she couldn't come. She thought about little Kofi, who was 4 years old now, and who was probably sitting in the auditorium with his mother, and who would not remember this day, but who would be told about it. Celestine was certain of this, for the rest of his life. She thought about her sister in Lagos who did not know, who had called this Sunday as she called every Sunday, and who had talked for 40 minutes about the price of fabric in the market, and a neighbor's wedding, and the rain in March, and who had not once suspected that her sister in Washington, D.C. was standing in a graduation staging area in a black gown. She thought about 19 years. She thought about Mrs. Holloway. She thought about Gerald Pitts, who was sitting somewhere in the auditorium right now, representing the administrative staff of Whitmore University at the graduation ceremony, which was an obligation of his role. She had seen his name on the printed program, listed among the administrative dignitaries who would be seated on the stage. Gerald Pitts, who had signed the letter that had said she would receive 6 weeks of severance pay, and who had never once looked up from his efficiency reports long enough to see that employee number 4471 had been sitting in the second row of classes in his university for 19 years. She was about to give him the opportunity to look up. The staging coordinator, a young woman with a tablet and a nervous energy that suggested this was her first graduation, came down the line checking names. She reached Celestine. Name, Celestine Amara Oduya. The coordinator found her on the tablet, made a small check, looked up briefly, caught the silver in Celestine's hair. visible below the graduation cap, looked back at the tablet, moved on. Celestine took a breath. The doors to the auditorium opened. Now, if you have made it this far, if you have been holding your breath since February, since the custodial closet, since the letter that said April 1st, hold on just a little longer. Because what happens in the next 8 minutes in the Whitmore University auditorium is the kind of moment that does not announce itself in advance. It does not arrive with a convoy. It does not arrive with a fleet of cars. It arrives with a name, spoken by a dean, in a room full of people, some of whom have been waiting 19 years to hear it, and some of whom have been in the same building as the woman who owns it for 18 months without ever learning it. And if you have, because this is the moment the entire story has been building towards since 4:47 a.m. on a morning in 2005, when a 40-year-old woman walked into the second row of an Introduction to Literature class and opened a notebook and wrote the date at the top of a page. The Whitmore University graduation ceremony followed a precise and practiced order. The president spoke. The dean of academic affairs spoke. The student speaker, a 23-year-old pre-law student named Darius, who had grown up in Southeast D.C. and who spoke with a directness and a grace that made the president lean over to the dean and say something that the front row could not hear, spoke. The honorary degree recipients were introduced. The university choir sang. And then the dean, Dean Patricia Osei Bonsu, a 62-year-old Ghanaian-American woman with 25 years in higher education, and the specific posture of someone who has survived a great deal and is not impressed by anything that has not earned it, stepped to the podium. She opened the list of graduates. She began to read names. The graduates walked across the stage in the order their names were called. Alphabetical by last name, divided by school and department. The English department was in the School of Arts and Sciences. The School of Arts and Sciences graduates were called in the second group. The Oz came midway through the alphabet. Celestine had walked across that stage many times. She had swept the floor under it in January and in May for 19 years. She had polished the wood of the steps leading up to it. She had vacuumed the carpet of the backstage area where the graduates waited for their names. She knew the temperature of this stage, warmer in the center from the spotlights, cooler to the left near the exit, and she knew the exact number of steps from the right entrance to the dean's position at center stage, 14 steps. She had counted them once, 8 years ago, on a May morning after the previous year's graduation, when she was cleaning the stage alone, and she had wondered, for the first time, not in the private voice of something she intended to pursue, but in the quieter voice of something that might be possible, what it would feel like to walk them. Now she was about to find out. Ngozi Ofrimensa Dean Osi Bonsu said. A young woman walked across the stage, Damilola Ogundimu, another student, Celestine Amara Oduya. The auditorium continued its gentle applause rhythm, the continuous backdrop of clapping that graduation ceremonies maintain as each name is called, the white noise of celebration, each name receiving its share. And then, something changed. It changed from the left side of the auditorium, row 7, where a 32-year-old pediatric doctor named Adeyemi Oduya was on her feet before her mother had taken her second step onto the stage. Adora was standing, and she was not doing the polite applause and wait thing that graduation audiences do for names they do not know. She was standing with both hands above her head, and she was making a sound. Not a scream, not a cheer exactly, but the specific vocalization of a woman whose chest has been full of something for the last 4 months, since a phone call on Christmas Day, when she found out her mother had been in school for 19 years and had not told her, a sound that said, "I see you, Mama. I have always seen you. And today everyone else is going to see you too." It came from row 7, and then it came from the row behind row 7, because the woman next to Adeyemi was Rochelle, who had taken the day off from the hair salon job she was still saving up to open, who had found out 3 days ago because Adeyemi had called Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Holloway had called Rochelle, and Rochelle had said, oh Lord, of course. Of course that woman was in school. And then Darnell, beside Rochelle, who had driven his wife's car across D.C. on a Wednesday morning, who was already crying in the way that large, quiet men sometimes cry when they have been ambushed by something beautiful. And then the section behind Adeyemi began to stand. And then the section beside it. Because here is what happened. Here is what the 314 other graduates and their 3,000 family members and the faculty on stage, and Gerald Pitts in his administrative seat on the stage, and Dean Patricia O.C. Bonsu at the podium all experienced in the same moment. They saw a 57-year-old woman in a black graduation gown, with silver hair visible below her capwalk onto the stage. They saw her walk the 14 steps to the dean. They saw the dean extend the diploma. And they saw, even those who had not known, even those for whom her name meant nothing a moment before, something in the way she walked those 14 steps that made it impossible to remain seated. She did not walk like the 22-year-olds who had walked before her. She did not walk with the forward-leaning urgency of youth, the slight nervous shuffle that comes from being 22 and wanting the moment to be over so you can celebrate with your friends. She walked the way a woman walks who has been waiting 19 years for 14 steps. She walked the way a woman walks who mopped this floor at 4:47 a.m. this morning, and every morning before it, and who is going to take every one of these 14 steps at the pace they deserve, because she has earned every single one of them separately, and they are not going to be rushed. She walked with her chin up. She walked with her hands at her sides. She walked with the specific grace of someone who has been invisible for so long that visibility, when it finally arrives, requires a particular kind of receiving. Not performance, not triumph, just the quiet permission to be seen. By the time she reached the dean, the auditorium was standing. Not 63 people. Not a section, the auditorium. Dean Patricia Osibansu, who had 25 years of higher education and who was not easily moved by anything that had not earned it, had stopped reading names. She was looking at Celestine. She extended the diploma. Celestine took it. Their hands met over the diploma for a moment longer than the ceremony required. The dean's face, which was the controlled professional face of a 62-year-old Ghanaian-American woman who did not often allow her expression to be read in public, did something that the front rows of the auditorium would spend the reception afterward trying to describe. Later, in the most accurate account, Adeyemi would say, "The dean looked at my mother the way you look at someone when you realize you have been in the same building as them for years without understanding what they were carrying." Celestine shook the dean's hand. She accepted her diploma. She turned to face the auditorium, not triumphantly, not theatrically. She simply turned, the way the protocol required every graduate to turn to face the audience for the photograph. And she saw them standing, all of them. She saw Adeyemi in row 7, both hands above her head, her face a wreck of beautiful crying. She saw little Kofi standing on his seat beside his mother, not understanding exactly what was happening, but understanding that it was important because his grandmother was on the stage, and everyone was making noise, and this was clearly the correct response. She saw Rochelle and Darnell. She saw Mrs. Holloway, who was somewhere in the middle section, who had come without being asked, who had worn her good coat. And she saw on the stage to the right of the podium Gerald Pitts. Gerald Pitts, who had signed the letter that said April 1st. Gerald Pitts, who had never looked up from his efficiency reports. Gerald Pitts, who was now seated on a stage in his good suit, surrounded by faculty members who were also standing and applauding, and who was faced with a specific and inescapable choice: to remain seated while every other person in the room was standing, which would require a kind of commitment to obliviousness that even Gerald Pitts could not sustain, or to stand. He stood. He stood the way people stand when they are standing for someone else's victory, and they know it, without joy, without grace, with the careful, neutral face of a man who has just understood something about his own actions that he would prefer not to understand. He stood. That was enough. That was all Celestine required of him. She did not look at him with triumph. She did not look at him with forgiveness. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man whose letters she folded and put in the pocket of her gray uniform and carried with her for 11 weeks, with the complete composure of someone who decided, a long time ago, that her journey was not about him. She turned away from Gerald Pitts. She looked at Adeyemi. She touched the diploma once. Her fingertips on the edge of it, the specific small touch of confirming something real. And then she walked the 14 steps back across the stage she had cleaned for 19 years. The auditorium did not sit down immediately. It was several seconds, long in a graduation ceremony, where the rhythm demands a constant forward movement of names, before the applause reduced enough for Dean Osibansu to return to the podium. Before she continued with the next name, she paused. She looked out at the auditorium. She looked at the list of names in front of her. She looked at Celestine, who had descended the stage stairs and was walking back to the graduate seating area. She said, departing from any script. "Ladies and gentlemen." Occasionally, This institution has the honor of graduating someone who has given us far more than we have given them. We are grateful, we are humbled, and we will do better, the auditorium responded. Gerald Pitts sat back down. His face was the face of a man who was trying to decide what he had just been told. The ceremony continued. After the ceremony, in the reception on the quad, Celestine stood with Adeyemi and Kofi and Rochelle and Darnell and Mrs. Holloway in the May afternoon light, and she accepted the embraces and the photographs and the congratulations with the same quiet dignity she had brought to everything for 57 years. Professor Adeyemi found her and held both her hands and said, "Mrs. Oduya, I had no idea. How did you sit in my class and not tell me?" she said. "Professor, I came to your class to learn, not to tell you my story. But I appreciate that you taught me something worth learning." Professor Webb found her. He held out his hand. He said, "I owe you an apology," she said. "You owe me nothing, Professor. You gave me 17 pages of notes," he said. "The paper on Hurston. The one I didn't know was yours. When I found out this morning," he stopped. He began again. "That paper was published in a journal, Mrs. Oduya. It has been cited 6 times, she nodded. She said, "I know." He shook his head slowly. He said, "We should have known who you were," she said. "You know now." At 4:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after she would normally have started her morning shift in Harrington Hall, Celestine Oduya sat on a bench on the Whitmore University quad with her diploma in her lap and her grandson Kofi asleep against her shoulder, and the May afternoon light settling slowly into evening. Adeyemi sat beside her, her head resting against her mother's arm, the way daughters rest against mothers when they have run out of adequate words. The cherry trees on the quad had finished blooming. The petals were on the ground. Celestine looked at the diploma, Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, Whitmore University. Conferred May 15, 2024. Signed by Dean Patricia Osei Bonsu. She thought about Emeka. She said quietly, "Not to Adora, not to Kofi, to no one in particular, and to one person in particular. I told you we would be okay." Adora heard her. She reached over and covered her mother's hand with her own without speaking. The quad was quiet now. Most of the families had gone to dinners and celebrations. The custodial crew, Celestine's replacement among them, a young woman she did not know, would come in the morning to clean up what the graduation had left behind. They would mop the auditorium stage. They would collect the programs from under the seats. They would return the quad to its daily self. The marble in Harrington Hall had learned the pattern of Celestine's mop. The marble in Harrington Hall would keep that pattern for a long time. And sometimes, in the early morning before the students arrived, when the light came through the tall windows at the angle that made the floor glow, someone would push a mop along those floors and not know that they were following in the tracks of a woman who had mopped those same floors and sat in those same buildings and thought about James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston, and the particular courage of people who refuse to be told they do not belong in the rooms where knowledge is kept, who had asked for a mop and a diploma and had accepted the mop first because she understood that sometimes love is patient, and sometimes love is 19 years, and sometimes love looks like getting up at 4:47 in the morning and going to work in the building where your dream lives and cleaning the floor under it until the day arrives when you can walk across it instead. Love, it turns out, does not need a convoy. Love does not need 12 black SUVs. Love does not need a helicopter landing or a private jet or a fleet of anything. Love needs 19 years and a mop and a 40-page thesis and a second-row seat in every classroom it can find. Love conquers. It just does it quietly. And on a Wednesday morning in February, in a custodial break room in Washington, D.C., it folded a termination letter and put it in the pocket of a gray uniform and went back to work, because it had 11 weeks left, and it intended to use every one of them. If you want to see who fate visits next, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because in these stories, the ones who mop the floors before anyone else arrives are often the ones who built the floor in the first place, and the ones who sign the termination letters. They always end up standing in the auditorium, whether they want to or not. Some people are handed a mop. Some of them ask for a diploma too. Be the one who asks.